Welcome to Codex History of Video Games. I'm Mike Coletta.
And I'm Tyler Osby.
And today we are doing our last episode on the book Console Wars by Blake J. Harris. Oh, Tyler, what a long road it's been.
Sure has. If you're getting sick of this book, you're good. This is the last episode of this book. So congratulations. We'll go back to doing something else. I'm not sure what we'll do next.
Yeah, I haven't really planned that out yet, which is very exciting. I have a couple little one-off ideas that I think will be fun, but we'll go to that when we get there. So today we're covering chapters 61 through the epilogue. Tyler, take it away.
That's the last bit of this book. It's sort of the wind down of, because we're in the later years of Sega's success in the 90s. And as we all know, spoilers for history, it does not last. So chapter 61 is called And Then There Were Three. Yeah, it's too bad. But, you know, there's rises and falls in the video game industry, and Sega is one of them. Probably one of the saddest, because they were so great. And then now, I mean, they put out good games now as a publisher, but they used to be more relevant, I guess, in the direction of gaming.
Man, big falls. Bigfalls.biz. Sega.
Yeah. So chapter 61 starts with Steve Race he's in full Steve Race mode at Sony now. He's Steve Racing, if I may. Can I say that?
Steve Racer.
A real Steve Racer. This chapter opens with him on a plane coming back from Summer CES, which was in Chicago, and the plane is just full of people from the video game industry because they're all going back to, I guess, wherever they came from, Los Angeles, a lot of them, but probably all over the country. And so the plane is full of these people, and they all want time with Steve because they're trying to get a job at Sony, or at least talk to him, see what's available, just putting the feelers out there, you know, because they knew that Sony was going to be part of PlayStation history, or Sony was going to make history with the PlayStation. Of course, Sony is part of PlayStation history. So the PlayStation wasn't out yet, but Steve Race was making waves here. They showed the PlayStation off at CES, and it was clearly amazing. They were like, look at all this 3D. It's so cool. And everybody was like, whoa, that's 3D. It's so cool. So Race and Sony both knew that you can't sell games, or you can't sell systems if you ain't got no games. And we know that too. That's our mantra here on this podcast.
It is our mantra. I say that every night before I go to bed.
Yeah. Can't sell a console if you ain't got no games. Good night.
That's it. That's exactly what I do. And for some reason, I'm always calling you right before I do it too.
Yeah.
Every time I call you. That's how we go tonight. Yeah.
Yeah. So Sony didn't really have any game development folks, because remember, this is their first foray into gaming. They make hardware. They make CD players. They make hi-fi systems. They make VCRs at this point. Yeah, Betamax was long gone. So they had hardware people, but nobody to make software for these things, especially not games. So they were trying to hire people left and right to make great software for the PlayStation. Remember Psygnosis? They bought Psygnosis.
Oh, yeah.
And Psygnosis made an amazing dev kit for the PlayStation, which made it really easy for great developers to make great games. And then they got EA on board by giving them an amazing deal. Instead of the usual $10 royalty on games that EA would have to pay when they sell their games to Sony, EA would only have to pay $2 per game for the life of the first PlayStation, as long as they could get 5 games ready in time for launch, which for a company like EA, that's easy.
Yeah, that's a really good deal.
They're just making tons of games all the time. 5 games for the launch of the PlayStation to get such a good deal on royalties, easy peasy. That was a really good idea.
I'd be curious to know how many games they actually release in a year at this time. EA.
Oh, that's a good question. This was like 1994, I guess, probably. So I wonder how many games EA released in 1994. Quite a bit for the Sega.
I'll do the Googling of this while you keep going.
Okay. So meanwhile, Tom Kalinske is starting to think that maybe Sega is a bit of a sinking ship. His old friend, Michael Milken, had started an educational game company with his brother, Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle. Some of our older listeners might remember Milken as the guy who pioneered the junk bond in the late 80s, which I'm not a finance person, so I'm not going to explain what a junk bond is, but it led the way to some economic problems, not unlike what we saw in the later 2000s.
Oh, dicey. By the way, numbers 72 games in 1994.
Wow, that's a lot of games.
So a lot of games. So 5 is super easy for them.
5 for the PlayStation, not a problem. Michael Milken also went to jail for doing the junk bond thing for 22 months. So that's who we're dealing with here. This guy was not only created a thing that caused a problem, but also went to jail for it. Also, if you are old enough to know who Michael Milken is, make sure you're getting plenty of fiber in your diet and make sure to schedule a prostate exam probably. But Kalinske wasn't ready to leave Sega just yet. He loved it too much, and he was too loyal to the team that he'd built at this point. But the thought was kind of in his head. You know, the seed had been planted that maybe Sega wasn't where he was going to stay forever.
Yeah, this whole part was interesting to me because I was definitely like, you're friends with Michael Milken?
Yeah.
That's some dicey friends there.
I know. And he wrote an op-ed in, I think it was the Los Angeles Times, it's in the book, talking about how Michael Milken was really great and we should actually be praising him for inventing the junk bond or something, even though he was going to jail. Or like, we shouldn't be sending this guy to jail. He's our best friend. So yeah. I don't know, maybe Kalinske made a bunch of money off of junk bonds or something.
Dicey propositions, either way.
Yeah. So that's a little weird. So then we transition to Peter Main, Minoru Arakawa, and Howard Phillips at Nintendo getting ready to do a Q&A online with this new thing called the internet, but they were doing it exclusively on CompuServe. Remember CompuServe?
Oh man, reading CompuServe brought back some old memories for me. It was really nice.
Yeah, that's if you remember CompuServe, it's probably time to get some orthopedic inserts for your shoes at this point. So
I have them.
You got them. Honestly,
okay. I got some Superfeed insoles. They feel great. Also,
I have Superfeed insoles too.
Nice, dude. Also, everyone should just be getting more fiber in your diet. Prostate exam, you can wait till 50, but fiber in your diet for sure.
Yeah. So this was kind of like a Reddit AMA. Before that was a thing. They used to do it in like chat rooms, and this was kind of the first time they did this, that Nintendo did this. So they were a little bit ahead of their time here, which is kind of neat. There's a whole transcript that's in the book that shows about 2 of the questions. I think they did 23 questions in total. The 2 that they show in the book, pretty softball questions where they gave like non-answers. Like one of them was like, Donkey Kong Country looks really good, or visually looks really good. But when you look at it, it looks like just basic gameplay. Do you think gamers are going to still like the just basic gameplay that doesn't innovate? And they just answer with, the gameplay is great. It totally innovates. Don't worry about it. Like that's the answer they gave.
Yeah, it's very softball answers and questions in this. I was kind of expecting something to go wrong, honestly.
Yeah, me too.
I thought we were going to get a weird moment.
Yeah, but nothing went wrong. I did do some Googling around to try to find a full transcript of this chat, but I couldn't find it anywhere. So if anybody out there knows where the transcript might be, I think it would be really fun to look at because I want to see what kinds of questions people were asking at an AMA in a CompuServe chat room. It must not have been big enough. Like, it must not have been very big. I have to imagine that these questions were not like gotcha questions. You know what I mean? They're just people who wanted to know genuinely because this thing probably wasn't going to be published anywhere. Like, the internet wasn't really a thing, so like getting clout wasn't really a thing. So they were probably just like really good questions.
I wonder if it was on the CompuServe website, and now that that's gone, it's just gone. Although you could use like Wayback Machine, that
maybe
website, to go back and see old things on websites.
Yeah, you probably could, or maybe somebody just has it somewhere. That would be cool. I mean, somebody had it for the book.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, he must have got a copy of it somehow, but Blake J. Harris, he's just getting all sorts of info. He's got the inside scoop. Someone probably honestly gave it to him that worked at Nintendo.
Let's just send him an email and see if he's got it.
I just want to send him an email and see if we can talk to him about this. I bet you he would. He seems like a cool guy.
He is a cool guy, I bet. But yeah, so Milken still trying to get Kalinske to leave Sega. This is like the next part that we transition into, which is tough because they had released the 32X, remember, that Kalinske didn't want to release, but had been they put America in charge of this stupid add-on that he thought was dumb and he didn't want to release, but he had to because that's what the bosses said. And they released the 32X on the same day as Nintendo released Donkey Kong Country, which is just symbolically just chef's kiss. You love to see it, from a literary perspective. And this was kind of indicative of their different strategies. Nintendo had games and Sega didn't. And Sega tried to make up for it with hardware, but the 32X was a total bust, and Kalinske knew it. He knew it before it even came out. He was not under any illusion that this was going to be a huge thing, because he knew you had to have games. He gets it. Kalinske, our boy Kalinske gets it. So,
dude, it was so heartbreaking reading this whole last part of the book because he saw all this coming.
Yeah.
And that's the rough part, is he could do nothing to stop it.
Yeah, he knew. Yeah, exactly. He knew exactly what was going down. And Sega of Japan was like, I don't know if they were doing it on purpose. It kind of feels like it. But remember, this book is told from the perspective of Kalinske. So, take everything kind of with a grain of salt. Of course, it's going to make him look good, right? It's easy for him to, in an interview 30 years later, to say, oh, yeah, I saw all this coming. I just knew this was going to happen, but we had to do it anyway. Like, that would have been really easy for him to do. Not that that's necessarily true, but I'm just saying, skepticism is healthy, right?
Yeah, we're gonna be skeptics, but I have some ranty-ish stuff later that bothers me.
Okay, I'm excited to get there. So yeah, Sega of Japan wanted the 32X, and they wanted Sega of America to make it, so they did. It was bad. Nobody liked it. Had no games. I can't even name a 32X game. I guess Doom came out on the 32X, and like Knuckles Chaotix. It didn't have a Sonic game. It needed a Sonic game. Knuckles Chaotix doesn't count. That's it. That's all I remember, though. Did you not have any 32X games? Did you have a 32X?
I never had a 32X, no. I'm impressed that you pulled out Knuckles, that game. I don't know any 32X games, honestly.
Yeah. I think it would have been a bit more successful if they had enough units at launch, because they wanted to have 1 million units, but they could only produce 400,000 units. And actually, people were excited for this thing, because remember, Sega had like clout, remember? So Sega could put out a new piece of hardware and people were stoked for it, but then they couldn't sell as many as they wanted to because they couldn't make as many as they wanted to. And then when there were no games for it, the demand sort of fizzled out. Like, they could have probably sold 1 million if they had 1 million ready to go on launch. But they only had 400,000. And by the time those all sold, people sort of figured it out that it wasn't really great. And it just kind of, after that, people didn't really want it because there's no games. You got to have games.
Yeah, it's a bummer.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep saying that this whole episode, because this whole thing is a bummer, just to let everyone know.
This whole episode's a bummer.
If you weren't aware, it's going to be a bummer.
Yeah, the downfall of Sega is a real bummer. So they decided to go all in on the Saturn, and they hoped that they didn't make gamers too mad with the 32X. So they picked a date, Saturday, September 2nd, 1995, and they called it Saturn Day. Get it?
Love it.
Yeah.
Love the puns on the days of the week. I'm into it. Good job, Sega.
Saturn Day is actually kind of, because isn't the name Saturday, isn't it named for the Roman god Saturn? Saturn's a Roman god, right?
Yeah. I think they all are named that way, aren't they?
Yeah. What Greek god does Saturn map to?
Oh, this is a question I knew as a kid, and you know what? We can just Google this.
Yeah.
We don't need to pretend like we know what's going on.
Yeah. So they would call it Saturn Day, like Sonic Tuesday, which I think is cute. But that was 9 months away, and Nintendo was crushing it with Donkey Kong Country right now.
You ready? Saturn's Greek god was Cronus.
Cronus. Okay.
Yeah. Whenever I hear Cronus, I think of a cronut, like a croissant donut, and that gets me excited. But yeah, Saturn is Cronus.
Okay. Well, now we know. Steve Race, at this point, over at Sony, was really upping the ante against Sega and using Sega's tactics against them. So Sony was running attack ads, and they really positioned themselves the same way that Sega did against Nintendo a couple of years earlier. This was still the mid-90s, so those kinds of things still worked. They might still work today, but the style was like in the 90s to like really go ham on disparaging your opponent, especially if your opponent is established, which at this point Sega was established and even beating Nintendo. So they were the incumbent, ready to be taken down a peg by the new guys, Sony and Steve Race. So Kalinske did still believe in the Saturn because he knew it wasn't about hardware or anything like that. He knew it was all about marketing. And he says in the book, this is a quote from the book where he says, "It's all just telling stories," which is something that, as a person who does communications for a living, I totally get. Everything is just telling stories. If you can tell the right story with the Saturn, you can get people to buy it because they want to be a part of that story. So they had to compete with Sony on their level and convince gamers that they were still cool and cooler than Sony. So they replaced Joe Montana with Deion Sanders for their sports games, the Sega Sports like sub-brand that they had going, which is like kind of a weird side story about Deion Sanders being extremely hard to work with versus Joe Montana, who was like super nice and very easy to work with.
He also loved talking about himself in the third person, which is always a charming trait in anyone you've ever met.
Yeah, that's a strange thing. So I honestly don't remember any Deion Sanders games, and I don't think the book talks about him again, so I'm not... maybe there were Deion Sanders games, but I don't think they did as well as Joe Montana.
Yeah.
Sony's attacks, though, actually bled into real life. In late 1995 at Winter CES, Steve Race and the guys at Sony defaced all their cool Sega stuff they had set up at the hotel and then filled the pool with PlayStation balloons. And like Kalinske was getting like tired of this. He was like, he goes to Steve Race because they're buds. And he's like, Steve, come on, man. Can you just stop? And Steve was like, no, I will not stop. He was all in on PlayStation.
Which we're going to find out is funny in a very terrible way. That's also a bummer at the end of this book.
Yeah. So another person over at Sega, Diane Fornager.
I've been saying Fornager, but
yeah.
I am not 100% on that because you know my track record with names on this podcast. It's not that great.
I'm going to go with Fornager. She's starting to think about leaving too because she was pregnant at this time and she had kind of hidden her pregnancy from the folks at work because she didn't want to like lose her job. Not that she would get fired for being pregnant, but she didn't want to be like treated differently and maybe people start to make plans without her because they knew she was going to be out. So she was hiding her pregnancy, but that got really difficult once she found out she was having triplets. And then after she discovered she lost 2 of her triplets, which is super sad, she blamed herself for stressing over work at Sega, which her doctor was like, nah, it's not that, which is probably the right thing for a doctor to say because you don't want to tell somebody when something like that happens that it was their fault. So Kalinske, though, to his credit, told her, take all the time you need. We can do this without you, and when you're ready to come back, we'll have a place for you. It's not a problem. We just hired this new head of marketing at that time, and he was a full-on marketing guy. And this is a little bit of a maybe an indicator, too, of where Sega was going. He did not care about the product. He didn't care about playing games. He didn't care about anything like that. He just wanted to sell it. Most of the people that worked at Sega, if they weren't straight-up gamers themselves, they at least got it, right? They understood what they were doing, and they understood why people liked games. And this guy just didn't care. He just wanted to come up with ways to sell these games. And so that's what Harris says. He's like, this is kind of symbolic. They were just another company now. They weren't that scrappy upstart that dethroned Nintendo that had tons of people who like were just there, like fueled by passion. Now they had people that were fueled by money because they had money to spend on people with experience. Like this guy, they say his name one time. It doesn't really matter. They were starting to get people who didn't really care about the mission, but they were very good at their jobs. So Kalinske thought, that's okay for the Saturn because there isn't much good here. We don't have like a lot of games and we really need marketing to work some miracles here. So this was kind of like a Hail Mary, like get the best marketing guy we possibly can. Maybe we can salvage this. And then he talks to Nakayama over in Sega of Japan, and Nakayama's like, you got to release the Saturn earlier. You got to release it at E3 in 1995 in the summer, which would have been like 3 or 4 months before the planned September release. The Saturn had already come out in Japan in like November of 1994, and it was doing really well because it had a port of Virtua Fighter, which was like the big hit in the arcade, so everybody loved Virtua Fighter, and because you could get a really, really good version of it on the Saturn was actually doing okay in Japan, and so they wanted to kind of rush it out for the rest of the world. They wanted to be the first to market, which is, to be fair, is not a terrible strategy. It worked for the Genesis in the 16-bit era. It would continue to work for the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox 360 in their day. Lots of times, the company with the console that gets to market first for a given generation, lots of times that company ends up doing pretty well. But Sega of America had plans for Saturn Day. Remember Saturn Day? That's what we want to call it, Saturn Day.
Saturn Day.
And they had all these ideas. They had all these things that were like set up for Saturn Day. But Nakayama's the boss, and if Kalinske didn't do it, they'd fire him and find somebody who would. And Kalinske was just like, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. And I just kind of picture him just like letting out a heavy sigh at this point and just being like, okay, fine, we're doing it, whatever. And like that, at this point, it's like, it's kind of over, for Kalinske. He can see that he's seen the writing on the wall for a while now. This isn't really a surprise for him, but at this point, getting told by Nakayama, no, throw away your plans for doing this in September. You're doing it in summer. It's just like, throw your hands up in the air and you just go, whatever. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I also don't even think, like, when I read this, I was like, is this the nail in the coffin? But no, in reality, the nail in the coffin happened a long time ago. And that was when you just completely decided to stick to the 2D model in the Saturn.
Yeah.
And not team up with Sony and not team up with Silicon Graphics. So really, this is just like another nail in the coffin that's not super effective. And like you were saying, in Nakayama's mind, he thought this was right. Because we did it before, so why not do it again?
Yeah, in Nakayama's mind, this is the move. You're right. And in Kalinski's mind, he's like, but we have all this stuff planned for Saturn Day. Like, if we have to do this early, then we have to launch without all that stuff, which is kind of a problem.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. So chapter 62 is called Fork in the Road. And it opens on May 11th, 1995. And we're finally at E3, and wowzers, is Tom Kalinske in a nostalgic mood. He's giving his inaugural address in front of all sorts of people we've met in this book, like Howard Phillips is there, Michael Katz is there. Michael Katz, by the way, is now a headhunter for the video game industry. And when I say headhunter, I mean he's 100% poaching Sega employees and taking them to Sony. That's what he's doing. Kalinsky's speech ends with the announcement that the Sega Saturn is out right now, and the crowd goes wild. But they kind of have to, because they're at E3, and it's a hype machine, so that's the thing.
Yeah.
But what we learn is all the hoops that Sega of America had to jump through to make it happen. One of the big ones is that they only had a certain number of Sega Saturns ready at this point in time.
Because they plan to release it in a couple of months. Like, it really feels like Nakayama didn't think this through.
Exactly. And so they now had to make a choice. Do they give every retailer a quarter of the product they ordered, or do they fill some orders fully and not give product to other retailers who did file an order? And on Bill White's advice, they choose the latter. So subsequently, Walmart, the store whose business they fought so hard for in the early chapters of this book, got none of their orders filled for the Sega Saturn. So that's going to be a problem.
Yep.
And then Kalinske ends his speech with the price of the Sega Saturn at $399. And he was optimistic when Olaf Olafsson got to the podium and began his speech about 3D keeping up with consumers of today, and that 2D didn't do much for realism. He's like, okay, we were kind of expecting this. But then Steve Race, who's quickly become a villain in our story, which I find so funny, did his famous 299 speech, which we've mentioned on the podcast before, but he walked up to the podium, said 299, walked off, just saying the PlayStation will sell for $100 cheaper.
Just the way
than the Sega Saturn.
He must have had a whole speech planned too. And then when he found out the Saturn was $399, he was just like, throw it all out. My new speech is just $299.
Yep. And then just walked off stage.
And the crowd goes wild.
Exactly. And where's Nintendo during all of this? Well, we'll hear from them next chapter. But Steve Race actually pranks Nintendo too. He's not just picking on Sega this whole time. Steve sent Howard Lincoln an invite to the Sony party as kind of a joke. But Howard Lincoln was like, that's very nice of you. Here's an invite to the Nintendo party at E3. And what did Steve Race do? He made a copy of the invitation, 500 copies, and told his staff to give the invites to any wacky weirdo they could find on the streets of Los Angeles. This is classic Steve Race.
Wow.
What we're learning is Steve Race, you want him on your team. You don't want him as an enemy, essentially.
Yeah, I can only imagine how that party went, because there's a lot of weirdos on the streets of Los Angeles.
Oh, 100%. Especially like downtown LA. Like people think downtown LA is like a place to hang out. It is not a place to hang out.
No.
Okay, it's very businessy, and that's about it. So Chapter 63 is called Killer Instinct, and now we're at the Nintendo part of this E3 presentation, and we start with a little speech by Howard Lincoln. And Howard Lincoln is talking about the three big things happening at Nintendo. First, the numbers of the video game industry are actually going down at this time.
Oh.
But no one's really worried, because Sega's sales are actually falling by 43%, and Nintendo's 16-bit sales are up 2%. So the market's plummeting mostly because Sega is plummeting. That's what's happening. But why is Nintendo not worried? Well, the second point of Howard Lincoln's presentation is that Donkey Kong Country has hit the 7.5 million cartridges sold mark. So this has given Nintendo the most valuable commodity at this moment for them, which is time. They can take their time now. So that leads into the third announcement, which is the delay of the then named Ultra 64 console from the fall of 1995 launch to now an April 1996 launch. Donkey Kong Country's sales gave Nintendo this wiggle room they needed, and they intended to get like more marketing and development time in, but even more importantly, in that time, Sony essentially was competing with Sega. So in fact, Sony kind of did Nintendo's dirty work for them. by really hurting Sega in this moment in time.
This is like classic Nintendo to let the other two guys fight it out while they just quietly continue making piles and piles of cash.
Dude, that's exactly what I was thinking. When I was reading this, I was 100% like, this is just like Microsoft and Sony.
Yeah.
But in the past by about 15 years. Like that's 100% what is going on here. So in the process of this too, Lincoln ends his speech with a jab at Sega. And here's a quote from it. It says, quote, first to market doesn't mean much. It's what you do, not when you do it. And most of you know the long-term viability of Genesis in America was not related to the time when the platform was launched. It was related to far more important factors. And Harris mentions that the only way this could have been more like a movie is if Howard Lincoln locked eyes with Tom Kalinske when he said this, because he didn't know Tom Kalinske was there. And Tom Kalinske probably didn't want it to be known that he was watching the presentation. And based on the whole book we've seen, I'm surprised that Harris didn't just write it this way.
Yeah.
Because he seems to do like some dramatic moments. So the fact that he said that means he was really showing some restraint here in the end to report it as it happened.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe it's a little bit of a stretch to like if he had known Kalinske was there, then maybe you could make that thing. But if you know he didn't know Kalinske was there, then it's harder to fudge that a little bit.
Exactly. And Peter Main then comes up and he's kind of everyone's fun uncle. And he goes up to talk next. And I feel like his part of this chapter and the rest of it it's like a page long, but it's a lot of like, we did it for Nintendo, which is good. They deserve it. They survived. They took some big hits. And honestly, we made fun of them for the whole stay the course thing, but it worked. It worked in the long run for them.
Yeah. They let Sega tucker themselves out, and then they went in for the kill.
Yep, Sega's star burned out, and then, Nintendo, they're just like a totally fine media. They're like our sun. They're just going to keep burning. They're fine. Mm-hmm. They're good. Little astronomy metaphor. Feels so good. Okay, here we go. Chapter 64. This is it. It's called Game Over. This is the last chapter of the book, and it's going to get sad. So here we go. We jumped 10 months since the last chapter. Sega is in shambles. The Saturn only sold 800,000 units, which is half of the PlayStation, but with twice as much time.
Oof.
So, yeah, that's just a sign that you have an inferior product. And many people had left the company, including Paul Rue and Tom Abramson, and everyone's jumping ship. And what's even weirder is, and I feel like we can go down a rabbit hole, and we talked about it earlier with Steve Race not really having a great time at the end of this book. It turns out that even though Sony is killing it and the PlayStation is killing it, all those Sony executives were fired or let go by 1996 after the PlayStation sold 10 million units. We're talking about Steve Race, Michael Schulhoff, and the man who started it all, really, Olaf Olafsson, were all fired or let go. And there's a Forbes article called Great Job, You're Fired that I was trying to find because I'm like, this would be a great follow-up episode at some point.
Yeah,
to just talk about this article.
Happened?
I can't find the article. I'm going to have to go in Wayback Machine and look and see if I can find it. But yeah, apparently they all were fired after doing an amazing job with this PlayStation launch. And in the book, Steve Race, in a not very nice way, says it's because they were not Japanese. He says it in a very different way. And if you want to know that way, that's inappropriate for this podcast, read the book. But I really want to know. I want to get to the bottom of this. Like, why were they fired? My guess is that once PlayStation realized that this is a moneymaker, they wanted to get people that were probably from like Sony of Japan involved in it because there was so much money to be made.
Dang.
That's my guess. And that's Steve Race's thought too. But it feels kind of bad. Especially for Olaf Olafsson, who's kind of like, not even kind of, he's written as a genius in this book. He's an author. He does all this stuff and he's a physicist. And it was kind of his baby in a way. Obviously it's not. Obviously it's Kudaragi's baby because he's the one that made it. But Olafsson was definitely the American side face of the company for this project. Yeah. And it just feels bad for him. So the real story in this chapter does involve Diane Fornager. She's been through a lot. It turns out that she had a miscarriage and lost all of her triplets. It's really depressing stuff. It's a sad part of the book. And we don't need to go into it because it's not video game related, but it's pretty rough. And she can't help but blame work and stress, even though the doctor told her that had nothing to do with it. But obviously it's a hard thing she's going through. So she goes up and meets with Kalinske because with Sega of America, she was struggling because Paul Rue left and was replaced by Makoto Kaneshiro, who was pushing Nights into Dreams, which is a game I think we've mentioned briefly before on this podcast. And For Nature was all about how this wouldn't work with an American audience. And I'm gonna take a little side tangent here because I don't know if you thought this when you read this. This is a term that got thrown around a lot like 2 or 3 years ago. It was used on Twitter constantly, and that term is gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
You remember that on Twitter?
Yeah.
Everyone said they were gaslighting each other. This is the definition of gaslighting from dictionary.com, okay? Psychological manipulation of a person, usually over an extended period of time, that causes the victim to question the validity of their own thoughts, perception of reality, or memories, and typically leads to confusion, loss of confidence and self-esteem, uncertainty of one's emotional or mental stability, and a dependency on the perpetrator. Now, tell me, Tyler, if this sounds to you like gaslighting. For Nature and Kaneshiro are working on plans for the second E3. Like, what's Sega going to do for the second E3? They sit down and get all the plans done, and the next day, For Nature notices that the plans are completely different. And when For Nature confronts Kaneshiro about this, he says, no, you approve this. You have just forgotten.
Yeah, that sounds like gaslighting, where it's like, no,
right?
you were cool with this, like, but she wasn't, though, because the plans are totally different now than what she made.
This is an actual, I just was excited because we have an actual written example of gaslighting here. Now,
yeah, absolutely.
There is no clarification on Harris's part, and he doesn't confirm whether or not she did actually forget or there was weird gaslighting, sinister stuff going on. But it's written like the serious gaslighting shenanigans going on. So I'm going to go with that. And I think we can all agree this is obviously a work environment that is not ideal. So she wants to leave, and she doesn't tell Kalinske this. I don't think she actually tells Kalinske directly that's happened, but she's trying to get out of Kalinske if he's going to leave when his contract is up in June. And Kalinske legally can't say anything because Sega is a publicly traded company in Japan. It would break the law if he said that he was leaving, if he told her.
Yeah.
But he tells her that she needs to do what's best for her, which I feel like is a nod to yeah.
That's like saying it without saying it. Yeah.
And she gets a good job. She goes to Universal Studios and works with Paul Rue again as the VP of marketing. And frankly, has a way better time. She gets the licenses for Spyro the Dragon and Crash Bandicoot for Universal, which is really cool.
Nice.
Because it's still like video game adjacent. Kalinske then decides after this that it's time to go. He tells Nakayama he's resigning, who is surprised, which I find strange because this is entirely his fault, but we'll get to that in a bit.
He's a surprise Pikachu at this point. He's like, what?
Yeah. And also, there's a part at the very beginning of this chapter where Tom Kalinske is looking at all the different ways this could have played out. And I'm intentionally leaving that out for right now so I can rant about it in a second when we talk about our thoughts with the book. But we end on a scene on a beach in Hawaii, which is nice, but we won't get into it because who cares about Tom Kalinske's personal life, right, Tyler?
Yeah.
The point is it's nice. And for Tom Kalinske, it goes fine. He gets to work on interactive education software for companies like Leapfrog and Knowledge Universe and Blackboard. And the important thing is that Tom Kalinske gets to do what he loves, and it turns out nice, and he's hanging out with his family and his kids, and that's how the book ends. But the epilogue is intriguing to me because it's 1 page long. And it's a short letter that Kalinske receives from Howard Lincoln, essentially praising him for all the hard work he's done at Sega and for the greater video game community, like as a whole business, which is nice.
Yeah, it's nice. Now that he's not a competitor, it's like, hey, you did a great job, which is, I guess, a nice thing to say.
It is. It's almost like after all the fighting, Howard Lincoln and Tom Kalinske kind of respect each other. But notice how there is no letter from Tom to Peter Main, though, because I'm pretty sure they still hate each other. And I do wonder if they still hate each other this day based on the whole like snow time fight incident.
To this day, Kalinske would still throw a punch if he saw Peter Main.
It wouldn't surprise me. So that's the book. That's the end of the book. And I have some final thoughts on it. In fact, there's actually a quote that I thought was really funny that I didn't know if you were going to talk about. And I wasn't expecting you to, Tyler. I kind of was actually excited that you left it out because this quote was really funny to me because I feel like it talks about us. You ready?
Yeah.
Kalinske gave this a moment of consideration. Quote, because in the video game industry, nobody cares about history. I'll just be the guy who was there for the fall. No one will remember anything before that.
We remember, Tom. That's
actually a quote from the chapter, and then there were 3. And I thought that was funny because I don't know if Tom Kalinski's going to go down as the guy who took the fall because of this book.
Yeah, I think he may have before this book came out. This was 2016, I think, when this book came out. So maybe, for 20 years he was the fall guy. But you're right though, because people will remember sort of he was the guy that was there for the fall, but he was also there for the rise. He orchestrated the rise, so it's not fair. If people think that he was just there for the fall, that's not fair.
Exactly. And now here's my ranty part, okay? When it talks in the beginning of the chapter about Tom Kalinski replaying everything in his head, I think it's fair to say we've all done that.
Mm-hmm.
In some capacity or another. You had something that didn't go your way, wherever it was in your life, and you replay all the different variables about how it could have changed or how it could have gone differently, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And he does it, and it's so frustrating to me because it's so clear. Looking back now, obviously in the moment there was no way to know, but looking back now, all the flubs that ruined Sega.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about it before, but the Silicon Graphics thing, the Sony partnership deal, the Nakayama now essentially pushing the date of the Saturn forward and screwing everything up, that educational device that just couldn't sell for the money they needed. So the one thing that Tom Kalinski really cared about just didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I got frustrated. I'm not gonna lie. I got frustrated reading this book. It gave me anxiety. How did you feel when you read it in all these parts?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely told from Kalinski's perspective, right? An interesting sort of counterpoint to this book would be one told from Sega of Japan's perspective, if there's a way to sort of justify the way that they treated Sega of America, which based on this book, it doesn't seem like there is, but that would be an interesting book to read if that story exists. But it does make you wonder, what if Sega of Japan had just let Sega of America do what they wanted, and even better, said, wow, you guys did such a good job, saving Sega in America and beating Nintendo over in America. You guys, we're going to let you take the reins for a little while. What do you want to do? Because they would have said, get this 32X out of here, make a console with Silicon Graphics, and we'll get a sweet Sonic game on the Sega 64, and we could be in a very different world now if that had happened. And Sega might be Nintendo now, and Nintendo might have fallen off. Nintendo might not even exist anymore, or would have gone third party the way that Sega did in the early 2000s. That could be very interesting.
Right now.
Yeah.
At Universal Studios, we could have had a Super Sega World instead.
Yeah. It would have been Green Hill Zone or something like that.
I would love
Mobius.
a Green Hill Zone theme park.
Yeah. That it could have been a different thing. Kalinski could have done what he wanted because, I mean, we don't know if that would have been successful. They could have messed it up in any number of ways, but that's a version of history that I would love to see what could have been. If Sega of Japan hadn't been so mean to Sega of America and just said, you guys are doing great work over there, let's give you more power rather than give you less power, and actually sort of, in some ways, you could argue that they sabotaged Sega of America, especially when it comes to stuff like the Saturn. Now, there's a justification for that, if we get it out early, that's good. Sure. But for Nakayama to say to Kalinski, no, you're doing it early, when Kalinski's like, no, we can't do it early because we have all these reasons to not do it early, Nakayama should have trusted Kalinski and said, okay, I trust you, do what you need to do. It might not have been any different, really, because the Saturn still had no games, but I don't know.
Yeah, it might have come out late enough that they had more games at launch. You never,
maybe.
That's, for me, it's interesting because when I picked up this book and we decided we were going to do this as a podcast, I was like, all right, who am I choosing? Sega or Nintendo as the one I'm rooting for? And it turns out all this book made me do was root against Sega of Japan.
Yeah, that's what it was. It was root for Sega of America. Nintendo is inconsequential. It's really Sega of Japan versus Sega of America.
Yeah, but then in the book, Tom Kalinski says that in this, he's mad at Sega of Japan, but then he's like, well, we wouldn't even be in the position we were in if we didn't beat Nintendo first. That was his mindset. And it just goes in circles. It's just really hard. I just want to know who the person was at Sega of Japan who made the decision to keep going 2D with the Sega Saturn. That is, to me, regardless of the Silicon Graphics deal, because it kind of is related to it, that is the biggest flub in this entire thing, is that you are not going to compete and innovate when everyone else is innovating, and you're not going to make new games. If Sega had their version of Donkey Kong Country. This could have been a whole different situation, extending the life of the Genesis. But they just
That's
didn't
what they hoped
innovate.
the 32X would do, I think. But there were no games. You got to have games. That's the thing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how good or bad your hardware is. You got to have games.
Gotta have games. That's, again, we always come back to it at the end of all our discussions. But I think the next thing for you and I to do maybe, and maybe we'll do this next week, maybe it'll be a couple weeks down the line, we should watch the documentary and talk about it.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I've seen it already before. It's pretty good.
We can watch it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. But for now, Tyler... Oh, also, before I skip ahead to the What You've Been Playing segment, I should mention this. I always say it every episode, but if you have thoughts on this book that you would like to share with us, we would love to hear them. codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com or go to codexpodcast.net and email us there. We'd love to hear from you, and we would definitely read those on the podcast. Our emails lately have been getting really long, which is cool. We're excited that you have a lot to say, but we can't read it all on the podcast. So if you want to send us a long email, that's fine, but I would say have a little snippet that you want us to read on the podcast. Does that make sense to you, Tyler? Because we've been getting some emails where I'm like, these are awesome emails, but this would take 10 minutes to get through on the podcast. And as we know from Nintendo, time is the most valuable commodity.
That's right.
That's what we learned in this chapter. Send us an email if you want to talk about console wars with us. We'd love that. And with that, now, Tyler, what have you been playing?
Well, I went back home for Thanksgiving this past week, so I didn't have a ton of time to play games, but I did have some plain flight time. Played some Mario Rabbids Sparks of Hope. Still working on that. Having a really good time. I'm like 7 or 8 hours in now. I'm just playing it in like really short bursts, and I'm playing it on hard mode, so I have to play some of the battles over again, which I actually really enjoy. I kind of like when I lose a battle in that game because it means I need to just start the battle over and try a different tactic, which I think is really fun. I'm having a really good time with that. Other than that, that's kind of it. I'm still reading Cliff Bleszinski's book, Control Freak. I'm about halfway through that. Really enjoying it. He's got some funny stories in there, and it's just fun to hear his perspective from like when they were developing the Unreal games, and we're getting into Gears of War now. It's where I'm at in the book, which is pretty cool. He seems like a fun guy, so I recommend his book. It's really good.
Yeah, I would read that book for sure. I mean, my whole goal with this podcast is to end up having a shelf of just video game books. And
yeah.
It's been going really great so far, mostly because Console Wars is a real thick book, so it's going to fill up that shelf. But also, I want more books. I was thinking about getting that replay book about European video game industry.
Yeah.
That's something we haven't really talked about that I am really interested in. Because they had their whole, we talked about, I think, a little bit last episode, but they had their whole shift where they were still PC gaming while all of us had NESs in America, which I find very cool that there's this like split there. We're totally different.
Yeah,
so I want to know about that.
Consoles didn't come out there till a little bit later, and by then PCs had kind of already took hold. So
yeah, they were having the PC versus console debate well before all of us did. So
yeah, it's kind of an interesting for at least for North American gamers. It's sort of an interesting like alternate history of what could have happened in America if things been a little bit different. So yeah, that's fun. What about you, Mike? What have you been playing?
So I hit max level on New World. Didn't think I would do it.
You did it. Great job.
I did it. Thank you. I'm at the new area, Brimstone Sands, which is pretty cool. The quests are really hard, but they reward really cool gear. So I'm kind of doing some endgame stuff, but it's very casual. I am not going very hardcore into this game. I am just playing it because the story is actually okay to me, and the expeditions are super fun. So probably after I play all the expeditions, I'm going to stop playing New World until new stuff comes out.
Yep,
then
that makes sense.
I've been playing some Jurassic World Evolution again, beat another challenge map on Jurassic difficulty, got 5 stars, NBD.
Nice.
I'm a professional dinosaur park person. And then been playing Pokemon Violet. I beat 2 gyms now. Yeah, I beat 2 gyms. I beat a Titan Pokemon, and I beat the first Team Star base. I'm not super far into the game. I'm probably like 4 or 5 hours in, but I'm having fun. I'm taking my time. I'm going through every zone and looking for all the Pokemon I don't have. And it's really fun. And yep, there's even more issues I'm just finding. There's so many people just one frame animating around me at all times, but whatever. The big thing about Pokemon Violet, though, that I love personally, it has an obsession with picnics and sandwiches that I also have. So I feel like I've never been closer to a Pokemon game in my entire life than this one.
Really speaking to you, huh?
Yeah, when you beat the Titan Pokemon, you find these Herba Mystica is what they're called, and those just make really dope sandwiches that make your motorcycle Pokemon way cooler. So
Nice.
I'm into it. It's super fun. I'm having a good time with it, and I threw it out there because I was looking at the Discord, like, is anyone playing this right now? I think Matt in Japan's playing it, so maybe him and I can do a trade or something.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds fun to me. Once
You
I
get
have
some
enough
Japanese Pokemon. Do they still do the thing where, so when you trade Pokemon, the one that you get gets more experience? I remember it being in some of the older games that if you got a Pokemon from somebody in the same region as you, it was like 1.5x experience, which is pretty sweet. But if you got one from another region, like somebody in Japan traded their Pokemon with you, it was like double XP. I wonder if that's a thing. You could get one from Matt in Japan, get a Japanese Pokemon, double XP.
I would love that. I'm going to talk to Matt about it. I'm going to DM him on Discord and be like, yo, we got to do a trade.
Yeah.
Sounds fun. But yeah, that's all I've been playing for now. As always, you can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can join our Discord by either clicking on the pinned tweet at the top of my profile at @mecoletta or getting an email from us. That works too. Tyler's on Twitter at SneakerElf, ELPH. And with that, who knows what we're doing next week, but it's going to be a surprise and it's going to be exciting. Tyler, do you want to say bye to everybody?
Goodbye, everybody.